Hey, it's Brent. Before we begin, I just want to say thank you to everyone who downloaded and listened to episode 1 of this podcast. The response exceeded my wildest expectations. And partially for that reason, I've decided to add a special feature to this podcast that I think you're going to enjoy. I'll tell you about that at the end of the show. Coming up, there's a new UDP leader again. The need to be safe versus the right to be free. And what's so special about summer at Election and Boundaries?
You're listening to Brent's 2 Cents, the semi-serious thoughts of a guy in Belize. And now here's the host of this podcast from somewhere in Belize City, Brent Toombs.
Let's go have some fun. Come on, we're young. And we're Amish. And it's Rumspringa.
Rumspringa! Woo!
Hey, welcome to the podcast for the week of July 13th. Or as I've decided to call it, the 13th day of Rumspringa in Belize.
Rumspringa! Woo!
Yeah, we're in this weird little time between when the state of emergency expired at the end of June and the international airport opens on August 15th. And everyone seems to think that we're in this safe little bubble where we're on a break from coronavirus. So they're going to the club, they're going to the bars, they're running around doing all kinds of stuff without their mask, maybe zip across the border, grab a little Mexican beer and a 96 pack of toilet paper. Because hey, we're on a break. We're on Rumspringa.
Rumspringa! Woo!
Let's behave like a bunch of Amish kids that are getting some time off from the colony. Well, if the border jumpers don't ruin it for everybody before then, I guess you've got till August 15th to get back on the program. And then after that, well, we're going to shun you. But enough of that. Let's get to the big story this week, and that's the UDP Convention. On Sunday, at the second UDP Leadership Convention in 5 months, Patrick Faber defeated John Saldivar. 567 delegates voted. 286 voted for Faber. 267 voted for Saldivar. Seti Ellington got 10 votes, and there were 4 rejected votes. So the margin of victory was only 19. Now, when you compare this to February, Saldivar had 342 votes versus Faber's 227 at that convention. So really the most important number is actually 59. You see, Faber won because 59 people who had voted for Saldivar in round 1 apparently flipped their support to Faber on Sunday. Now we know that Shine Barrow was one of those recent converts, but it appears that 3 other UDP standard bearers must have flipped as well, which would add up to 60, assuming all delegates voted according to the wishes of their political masters. Now, in my opinion, considering his association with the likes of Danny Mason and Lev Derman, John Saldivar was a deeply flawed candidate. So flawed that he had no option except to resign days after winning the February convention. But Saldivar bet his political future on hopes that with a little bit of time and a bit more grease on the campaign wheels, that he could once again be elected to lead the UDP. And if he did that, it would be some sort of absolution for whatever sins he may have committed in the past. I think many in the UDP are relieved with the results from Sunday, and they are feeling much better about their party's chances in the upcoming election. However, you can't overlook the fact that only 59 out of the 340 delegates who previously supported Saldivar had a change of heart. So I say the UDP still has a lot of soul searching to do before they will be ready to ask Belizeans to give them a 4th term in office. Now, do the convention results help or hurt the UDP's chances of winning a 4th consecutive term? Well, for starters, I don't think the UDP would have had a snowball's chance in Belize if Saldivar had become their party leader. So electing Patrick Faber certainly doesn't hurt their chances. But not only does Faber need to mend fences inside his party, he's got the unions to contend with. The teachers aren't happy, And quite frankly, I don't think any union is going to be thrilled with any administration given the current state of affairs. But unlike the turbulent last few years of the Musa administration, this time the unions have not gravitated towards the opposition party out of frustration with government. At least not yet. One big advantage that Faber will enjoy is that his name has not been associated with major scandals. It will be much easier for him to campaign on promises for the future rather than be expected to defend sins of the past. The PUP, it appears to me at least, may have just been sitting back and waiting for the UDP to hand them the election. Well, now it's not going to be quite that easy, and I think there is a chance for the UDP to win a historic fourth consecutive term. But hey, what do I know? I thought that by the time you were listening to this podcast, that John Saldivar was going to be the leader-elect of the UDP.
We want to hear from you. You can find Brent's 2 Cents on Twitter and Facebook at 2 Cents Belize, or email us at podcast@oxaproductions.com. That's OXAProductions.com.
On Monday of last week, LA Fashions Boutique, a women's clothing store in Belize City, created a bit of a stir on Facebook when they put up a post saying they are banning men from their store for as long as masks are mandatory in public. They say their female customers don't feel safe, and that most armed robberies of late have been committed by men. Now, I understand the concern for personal safety. I too feel that whenever I'm in a store or restaurant, and I find myself constantly watching the door, wondering if today is the day that I will be in the wrong place at the wrong time. And there has been a spike in the number of armed robberies lately. Criminals are enjoying the advantage of mandatory mask wearing to hide their identity. But banning men is discrimination based on gender, and that is unconstitutional. I did reach out to LA Fashions for comment, but they said they didn't want to speak to me about this matter. They did, however, confirm that their ban on men will continue for as long as masks are required. Had they agreed to speak with me, my question would have been, what other measures have you tried before resorting to trampling on the rights of 50% of Belizeans? Having security check your customers for weapons, for example. Photographing patrons, or asking them to show identification and recording that information. Yes, it's inconvenient and it's costly, but what price is too high to pay in order to maintain our rights? How do we balance the desire to be safe with the rights of the individual to be free? On Tuesday of last week, in a pre-dawn raid, police detained 99 alleged gang members. At least 27 will be held in prison for 30 days. A state of emergency for Southside Belize City has been declared. The purpose of this state of emergency is to give security forces the extraordinary powers they need to implement preventative detention. The Barrow administration first floated the idea of preventative detention shortly after coming to power in 2008. They dropped that idea about a month later, following public condemnation for such a draconian law. Then in 2011, after a spike in violent crime, a crime control bill that included preventative detention was introduced in the House of Representatives. But before that law could be ratified, the Constitution needed to be amended. Now, at the time, the UDP had the 3/4 majority needed to change the Constitution, but only after a 90-day public consultation period. Once again, public support was less than enthusiastic, and Prime Minister Barrow once again dropped the idea of incarcerating Belizeans before they could commit a crime. Now, in 2020, we finally do have preventative detention. Only instead of it being constitutionally sanctioned, it's being done under a state of emergency, for the second time in 4 months. This time, it's 27 Belizeans who were locked up for a month with no due process. Meanwhile, Southside residents, including a number of single mothers, are struggling to find the money to replace busted doors that were kicked down by heavily armed paramilitary police in the middle of the night. This extreme response will probably help the crime stats for a while. The police have flexed their muscle, and the gangs will go underground for a few weeks or maybe a few months. But they are not going away. Preventative detention is not going to address the root problems that allow gang culture to flourish. It's not going to stop more young boys from being recruited or seduced by the gang lifestyle. What it will do is further reinforce the opinion that many Southside residents share. The police are the enemy. Now, I'm not trying to sound like a bleeding heart for criminals. Anyone who terrorizes our communities or puts our lives at risk deserves to be in prison. But suspending the rights of citizens in the hopes of finding a quick fix for crime is a slippery slope we should not go down easily. So the same question I wanted to ask of the clothing boutique, I ask of the Ministry of National Security. What else could you have tried first before suspending the constitutional rights of Belizeans? One of the strongest recommendations put forth in the Gale Report on male participation in urban violence in Belize was the abandonment of paramilitary-style policing. Dr. Gale's 400-page report listed numerous other recommendations on how to reduce crime, on how to keep boys from joining gangs, and how the police can keep communities safe by becoming allies instead of enemies. That report will turn 10 years old in November. How many of Dr. Gale's recommendations have been tried or implemented? How many people have even bothered to read the report? To register to vote in Belize, you must be 18 years of age or older, a citizen of Belize or a Commonwealth citizen who has resided in Belize for at least 12 months. Once eligible, you have to register in the electoral division where you ordinarily reside. Now, new voters can register pretty much any business day of the year. And if you move to a different electoral division, you must transfer your voter registration to your new division. But that can only be done in July and August. Why? Why create a year-long backlog that can only be cleared up during an 8-week period each summer? Well, I tried several times to get an official response from Election and Boundaries. Finally, I spoke to a senior official at the department who promised to reply in writing to my questions. However, he did acknowledge during the call that the transfer of registrations are only permitted in July and August because, well, that's the law. One reason he did suggest for that law may be that by allowing only a 2-month transfer window, it can reduce costs for the department, because otherwise, hypothetically, a voter could move every 2 months and be eligible to transfer their registration as many as 6 times per year. In 2018, a full re-registration process was carried out at a reported cost of $8 million. It had been 21 years since the previous re-registration, and the 2018 exercise was 11 years overdue. Now, the purpose of re-registration is to clean the voter's roll of people who may have become deceased or no longer live in Belize. It is also to make sure that people are registered in the division where they actually live. A big problem with registration or transferring of registration is how easy it is to get on the voters list in a division where you don't actually live, and how hard it is to remove fraudulently registered voters. The politicos call these people phantom voters, but they are real people, just registered in the wrong division. It's a practice that both major political parties engage in. Once a person registers, an officer from Election and Boundaries is dispatched to verify that the voter actually lives where they claim to live. But really, all that requires is for the Election and Boundaries official to ask anyone at that address if so-and-so lives here. And as long as anyone is willing to say yes, it doesn't matter if there are 40 people claiming to live in a 2-bedroom bungalow or 20 people claiming to live at a restaurant. There is no requirement that the vetting officer use basic common sense and flag those registrations as suspicious. The penalty for participating in voter fraud is a $1,000 fine and/or 6 months in prison. but I cannot recall anyone ever being charged with voter fraud in Belize. In 2019, it became news when a senior registering officer denied a person well known to be a member of a political party to register in Caribbean shores. This officer was overruled by the chief elections officer, who ordered her to add the person to the list. That officer was then replaced by a junior officer. Chief Elections Officer Josephine Tamai denies that there was any political motivation to her directive to overrule her subordinate. Lawyers became involved, and the matter was forwarded to the Public Employees Commission. There is a small window after the voters list is updated for challenging registrations, but the burden of proof is onerous. The court, as they should be, are very reluctant to disenfranchise anyone. Few challenges, if any, are ever successful. Instead, it is mostly accepted that both parties will engage in these kind of shenanigans, and most people shrug it off, thinking that, a few phantom voters here and there, it really won't make much difference in the big scheme of things. But it does. In the 2015 general election, there were 7 divisions decided by less than 100 votes. In Stand Creek West, the margin of victory was 8. Of those 7 divisions, the PUP won 3. But if they could have picked up the other 4 tightly contested divisions, they would have won the election. So when you look at that metric, the UDP would have lost the 2015 elections if the PUP had secured an extra 314 strategically placed votes. And that's your why. The politicians want voter transfers confined to 2 months only because it's easier for them to manage the process. They can focus their machinery on getting the people they believe will be loyal moved into their own divisions. Most of those people will be legitimate residents of their newly registered constituency, but more than a few will be phantom voters, especially in divisions with a historically small margin of victory. One of the problems with how our voters list is managed is that the Election and Boundaries Department is politically controlled. The Chief Elections Officer reports to the Minister of Public Service and the Election and Boundaries Commission. The chair of the Election and Boundaries Commission is politically appointed. So if the politicians want policies that give them an advantage, it's highly unlikely that anyone at Election and Boundaries is going to be able to buck that system, regardless of how dedicated they may be to doing their jobs with integrity. The Election and Boundaries Department needs to be removed from the grasp of politicians. It should be an independent body similar to the judiciary. Only then will we be able to put in common sense checks and balances that will do away with phantom voter registration. Now, before we wrap up this podcast, a little bit of good news. And I apologize that this is sort of a humble brag. But the response to episode 1 was amazing. Over 400 downloads in the first 4 days. And in the world of independent podcasting, that is extremely good. To put it in perspective, 50% of all podcasts are lucky to get 160 downloads in the first 3 months. So thank you to everyone who downloaded this podcast, and especially anyone who shared this podcast with someone who otherwise may not have known about it. So I've decided I'm going to add a new feature to this show to give you an opportunity to be even more engaged. It's a feature I'm going to call Your 2 Cents, and it's an invitation to you to share whatever is on your mind. Maybe it's something you heard on the show, like whether or not the Belize airport should open in August. Or maybe it's something you think is important that the rest of us need to start thinking about. It could be a compliment, a critique, or maybe you just hate this podcast and you want to tell me to piss off. But I want to hear what's on your mind. I want to know your 2 cents. Now here's how you can give me your 2 cents. Go to the Facebook page for Brent's 2 cents and you'll see a big blue button for WhatsApp in the top right corner of the page. Click that button and it will open WhatsApp on your device. hit the little microphone next to the spot where you usually type in text and begin recording a voice message. I would love it if you would begin your message by saying your first name and where you're calling from, but if you prefer to be anonymous, that's totally okay. Just try to keep your comment to a minute or less, if possible. And finally, before I wrap up, I want to tell you about another Belizean podcast that I've been enjoying. It's called The Gray Spaces. It's produced by Andre Marsden with writing contribution from Ingrid Furlow. These two young Belizeans do an amazing job putting together a podcast that, in both terms of production quality and content, is excellent. The Gray Spaces explores the hazy overlaps of history, politics, and society in Belize. Andre does a great job as host, weaving stories that somehow interconnect events and issues that on the surface may appear to be completely disconnected. One minute he's talking about COVID-19, and then it's the 1931 hurricane, and then it's why Belizeans need to grow their own food, and somehow it all makes sense. Plus he brings in lots and lots of experts into the conversation. So if you enjoy podcasts that entertain and inform, I highly recommend The Gray Spaces. There are 3 episodes waiting for you to download, and Andre tells me that the next episode is hopefully coming out later this month. Okay, that's going to do it for the podcast. I want to say thank you to everyone who listened to this episode. Thanks to everyone who sent in messages of encouragement or shared links on social media to let people know about Brent's 2 Cents. And remember, you can subscribe to Brent's 2 Cents wherever you find your podcasts. And if you enjoyed this show, please leave us a review. I'd love to hear from you. You can contact me through social media at 2 Cents Belize on both Facebook and Twitter, or you can email me at podcast@oshaproductions.com. That's podcast@oxaproductions.com. And of course, you can even leave me a voice comment via the WhatsApp link on the Brent's 2 Cents Facebook page, and I will play that comment on a future episode of this show. And that's a wrap on episode 2 of Brent's 2 Cents. Until next time, please stay safe, wash your hands, wear your mask, and most importantly, be nice to each other.
Brent's 2 Cents is a presentation of OSHA Productions, Belize's affordable professional video production company.
Rumspringa is over for me, so...